Okay, welcome back. Hope you found that introduction to ESXtop useful. We're now going to use ESXtop to monitor CPU activity. In this lesson, we're going to identify key CPU metrics to monitor, use metrics in ESXtop, and monitor CPU usage. Essentially, what we're here for are to understand some of those important metrics, the important columns in ESXtop to find those key performance indicators. While we can't cover every single column in every single report, we want to highlight some of those important ones and get some of the basics out of each of the different screens. So first things first, right? To determine how well the CPU is running, you will need to review the key performance indicators in ESXtop. And those important indicators are these that we list here. There are some that we would consider, critical for the host, right? The ones for the host would be things such as whether or not is the host experiencing high CPU utilization. That would be displayed under the pCPU utilization details. There's also considerations for unusually low CPU utilization. You'd find out under the same column, the pCPU utilizations. If you have hyper-threading, and you'd want to be able to differentiate between hyper-threads and core utilization, then you look at the core utilization row. In fact, that core utilization row will only appear if you have hyper-threading enabled. Those pCPUs, as we'll see here in a couple slides, could indicate hyper-threads or they could indicate individual CPU cores. It really depends on whether you have hyper-threading enabled. Those pCPU metrics are interchangeable in a sense. They generally represent hyper-threads if you've got hyper-threading enabled, but if you just don't have hyper-threading, then they represent the cores. So how do you know? Well, if that core utilization row exists, then you know you have hyper-threading. If it doesn't exist, then there is no hyper-threading in that server. Also, a very important one is the CPU load average. This looks at how much of a backlog is there on your system regarding scheduling CPU activity. Now, there is also a whole set of metrics, important key performance indicators for managing and monitoring virtual machines. So not only do we want to look at the host CPU usage, but we can also check per VM details, verify whether the VMs have high vCPU usage or maybe unusually low CPU usage. Single column to represent that's percent used in the VM section of the report. Also, ready time, very important way to measure whether or not there's contention. And then there's also co-stops with CSTP. Again, you're measuring to see is a VM too large for its workload potentially. You can also look at what's called max limited time, MLMTD. What this displays are the times in which a VM was not able to be scheduled to a CPU because of an administrative limit applied to the VM. So somebody went and applied maybe an unusually low limit, which they shouldn't have done, and the VM is being prevented access to the CPU because of that. So it's not because of contention, but it's because of an administrative change. There are also some metrics in the CPU screen that are useful in helping the admin be pointed over to maybe a different area in the tool itself. For instance, there's VM wait. This is showing us how much time or the percentage of time the VM actually had to wait on storage I/O as opposed to waiting for getting time to the CPU. Remember, when a VM needs resources other than CPU, like for instance storage or networking, the VM will volunteer its time off of the processor, and so now it's waiting on that thing. So if we're waiting on storage, well then maybe we don't have a CPU problem, we might have a different kind of problem. Same thing, there's also a column called swap wait, which is again another reason why a VM may not get to a CPU is because we're waiting on swapping activity to finish. So now that prevents the VM from getting access to the CPU. But again, that's not because of CPU contention, that's because of now a shortage in memory likely. And also keep in mind, when VMs have multiple CPUs, you can actually track each individual virtual CPU. You can do that by verifying how many worlds exist in the VM. Usually the VMs who have more worlds probably have more virtual CPUs. You can actually use ESXtop to expand and display individual world statistics. So the default screen, right? You launch ESXtop, it'll bring in the CPU screen by default. And right across the top, you see some important details. Like for instance, above where even we've highlighted, you'll see we can see their uptime in terms of days. We can see how many worlds there are. That's not number of VMs. That's number of schedulable items. We see there are 4 VMs though, and there are 6 virtual CPUs. So that's 6 worlds right there. And there's 560 worlds total. So there's a lot of worlds that have actually probably not a whole lot to do with VMs, system worlds as we refer to them. You also have this CPU load average. This is a great headline view of getting an idea of how loaded is that ESX server. The CPU load average is broken into 3 fields. The first one on the left is telling us the load average for the past minute. The next one is for the past 5 minutes. And then the third one on the right is for the past 15 minutes. So you can get a little bit of a historical load average here. And what does it report? It basically provides you with the average CPU load per core, right? So when you think of that, right, if I have in this particular system, I see I have 4 cores and it's telling me I'm running with, 0.09 worlds per core, right? That's a pretty low number, right? If it had said 1, right? If it said 1 in the load average, that means that every one of your ESX server CPUs has a world running on it. Right, so that's kind of giving you an idea right there. This system is running at 100% if you've got this set to 1, right? These load averages are going to be small numbers, right? If it's set to 1, or if it says it reports 1, that means that the average per actual processor is 1 world running. But that's not necessarily an actual problem. It's a busy server for sure, right? Are there any virtual machines waiting in a queue? Well, that's if the number is greater than 1. If it happened to have said 2, on the other hand, it would have said that the average load on every single processor has a world running on it and also a world waiting, right? Running in a queue. So if 2s aren't good, that means that every CPU has a VM queued up wanting CPU. Because remember, when they're ready, they want CPU. So you want these numbers to be low. You actually want them to be less than 1 usually, right? If you're seeing 2 in the past minute, well, that may just be a spike. If you see a 2 over on the right-hand metric, well, that's for the past 15 minutes that there's been 2 worlds running on every single processor. That's getting more serious. So you can get the further details over on the main part of the screen, telling me my pCPU utilization numbers and my core utilization numbers. So by the fact that we can see this core utilization metric, we know we have hyperthreading. So you actually can see that the way how this is organized, it's broken it down by core. We've outlined it for you in these red boxes here, right? We have 4 cores. We see the individual statistics on each core. And we can tell, right, these are really low numbers, which makes sense. These are telling me around the same basic percentage, right? About 9% of the core, right? The average load on a core is about 9%. And so that's what we're seeing here, about 9% on these different cores. Now, it's also going to break it down by hyperthreads, which is what the pCPUs represent when this core utilization row exists. So we see the 2 hyperthreads for the first core, the next 2 hyperthreads for the next core, and so on and so forth. And you'll probably note that these numbers actually generally will be very closely adding up to whatever the core utilization is. It may not be exact, it may not be precise. That's usually due to either rounding and due to just the sample interval. So we have our system-wide metrics above the black bar. And then below the black bar, we have per VM details. Now, the interesting thing about the per VM details are that you'll note that the CPU metrics actually aggregate the statistics by design. So you notice we happen to have 4 VMs in our picture, and it says that, right? It tells me we have 4 VMs, and then there's 4 VMs highlighted. The things that people kind of get a little bit surprised about is that when you look at some of these numbers here, we see that, let's see, these VMs have these interesting columns. There's a wait column, there's an idle column. Notice they're way over 100%. And you wonder, how can a VM be 999% of its time waiting, since percentages can only go up to 100, right? And the reason why these numbers are so high, and of course these numbers are so high, well, if we look at this number, 990, and then kind of compare that with this, the number of worlds. And so these 2 VMs have 10 worlds each. These 2 VMs happen to have 6 worlds each. And now these numbers, I think, make a little bit more sense. If you were to take these numbers and divide them by 10, for the ones that have 10 worlds, or take these 2 numbers and divide them by 6 since there are 6 worlds, you'll understand that when you see these CPU metrics, they really are an aggregate for all the worlds. So you have to take that into account when you look at these numbers initially, because you may wonder, well, how is a VM going to have such a high percentage of all kinds of metrics? It's because we aggregate all the worlds together. To get individual world statistics, what you can do is a neat feature of ESX Top. You can expand on certain elements in the reports. Each of the different reports have usually some kind of expansion option. For CPU in particular and for storage is where you really find the expansions. Now, you'll note if you were to look at the help screen on the CPU monitor here, right? If you're on the CPU screen and you go into the help screen for the CPUs, you'll find that one of the options in the help screen will show the letter E, which stands for expand. And what you'll do is you can expand. So hit the letter E, it will prompt you, it says group to expand or roll up. And so what you'll notice, every one of these VMs is represented by a group ID. They're also represented by an ID, and they're the same here. Well, that's because this is what we call a collapsed view of each of the different virtual machines without considering their individual world statistics. If I were to use one of these numbers, say for instance, I'll just go ahead and use the 299,335, right? If I just type in those numbers up here, what it will do is it'll take that group ID and expand ESX Top to show individual worlds. So here we have all the same group ID, and then here are all the world IDs on the left. So when you have it expanded, the left-hand column becomes the world IDs. When it's collapsed, the ID column actually represents the group ID. But here we see all the worlds. This VM was made up of 10 worlds. So now we see there are 10 worlds we've expanded. And of those 10 worlds, 2 are virtual CPU worlds. And those are probably the ones that are most interesting to us. Because, all these other ones are there to mostly support and administer the VM. But when it comes time for when the VM wants to do work, it's going to use its virtual CPUs to do it. So I can see my per virtual CPU statistics. And now the numbers make much more sense. Look at my weight now. They're all, under 100%. My idle, they're all less than 100%. And this use is no longer this 11%. It's now basically telling me individual virtual CPU details, which can be useful because then you can kind of get an idea, are the 2 virtual CPUs working together? Or is one being heavily used and the other one idle? You can see all these things by expanding on those worlds. And you can hit the E button again and type in the group ID one more time and it'll collapse the view back the way it was before. So what are these metrics? These metrics on a per VM basis, we want to be able to measure how much the VM has used its processor. So that's that per vCPU usage. We may want to find out what the ready value is, right? So the VM who needed the CPU was able to get there 36 or 37% of the time. When it needed the CPU, it didn't wait very long at all. Right? Less than 1%. And that's good because you really don't want the ready value to be more than 10% for any one of your virtual CPUs. So this VM is getting its CPU scheduled whenever he wants effectively, right? Idling, right? Well, this is a VM has absolutely nothing to do 66 or 67% of the time. Now there's actually all kinds of idling here. There's wait, which is basically adding up all the times that the VM had really nothing to do, but he was doing no CPU work. It may be doing other work. So wait time would include VM wait. This is the percentage of time that the VM had to wait on I/O. If this is a high number, then we're probably waiting on I/O longer than we should. But this is kind of a normal little tiny number here. But this is telling us the percentage of time that we had to wait on I/O. Then we have idle, which is the time that we actually had nothing to do. Then there's also swap wait, which is the time that we had to wait on VM swapping for this VM. So the swap wait and idle and VM wait all add up to the wait value. They don't add up exactly in a linear summation here because VM wait, which is disk I/O, and swap wait, which is causing swapping, is also going to incur disk I/O. These numbers are not separate. They're usually kind of, swap wait will also cause VM wait, but VM wait on its own will probably mean the VM just uses storage and it's volunteering its time off the CPU. Co-stops are important because, again, it's telling us whether or not the VM has too many virtual CPUs and we're having to co-stop the VM. We generally want that to be also a really low number, less than 3%. Swap wait should be less than 5%. So these are some of the important key performance indicators. And so, like I said, usage is great because it tells you whether or not the VM is even on the processor. But as far as when it's coming to contention, you're looking at things like ready values. Because ready values are, we're waiting for the CPU and we can't get there. VM wait, we're waiting on another resource altogether. The nice thing about the CPU screen is it can tell you that you need to be looking at a different screen. So VM wait might be telling you you need to be looking at one of the storage screens. The VM wait would be telling you you probably need to be looking at a memory screen. Right? Co-stop's telling you your VM might be too big for its workload. So we took a look at some of those important indicators. Let's take another quick break here, and we're going to come back and then narrow down what it is that we need to be looking for specifically.